"6 pints of bitter," said Ford Prefect to the barman of the Horse and Groom. "And quickly, please, the world's about to end." The barman of the Horse and Groom didn't deserve this sort of treatment. He was a dignified old man. He pushed his glasses up his nose and blinked at Ford Prefect. Ford ignored him and stared out of the window, so the barman looked instead at Arthur, who shrugged helplessly and said nothing. So the barman said, "Oh yes, sir, nice weather for it," and started pulling pints. He tried again. "Gonna watch the match this afternoon, then?" Ford glanced round at him. No point," he said, and looked back out of the window. "What's that, foregone conclusion, then, you reckon?" said the barman. "Arsenal without a chance?" No, said Ford. "It's just that the world's about to end." "Oh yes, sir, so you said," said the barman, looking over his glasses, this time at Arthur. "Lucky escape for Arsenal if it did." Ford looked back genuinely surprised. "No, not really," he said. He frowned. The barman breathed in heavily. "There you are, sir, 6 pints," he said. Arthur smiled at him wanly and shrugged again. He turned and smiled wanly at the rest of the pub, just in case any of them had heard what was going on. None of them had, and none of them could understand what he was smiling at them for. A man sitting next to Ford at the bar looked at the two men, looked at the 6 pints, did a swift burst of mental arithmetic, arrived at an answer he liked, and grinned a stupid, hopeful grin at them. "Get off," said Ford, "they're ours," giving him a look that would have made an Algolian sun tiger get on with what it was doing. Ford slapped a £5 note on the bar. He said, "Keep the change." "What, from a fiver?" "Thank you, sir." "You've got 10 minutes left to spend it." The barman decided simply to walk away for a bit. "Ford," said Arthur, "would you please tell me what the hell is going on?" "Drink up," said Ford. "You've got 3 pints to get through." "3 pints?" said Arthur. "At lunchtime?" The man next to Ford grinned and nodded happily. Ford ignored him. He said, "Time is an illusion, lunchtime doubly so." "Very deep," said Arthur. "You could send that in to the Reader's Digest. They've got a page for people like you." "Drink up." "Why 3 pints all of a sudden?" "Muscle relaxant. You're going to need it." "Muscle relaxant?" Arthur stared into his beer. "Did I do anything wrong today?" he said. "Or has the world always been like this, and I've been too wrapped up in myself to notice?" "All right," said Ford. "I'll try to explain. How long have we known each other?" How long, Arthur thought. About 5 years, maybe 6. Most of it seemed to make some kind of sense at the time. "All right," said Ford. "How would you react if I said I'm not from Guildford after all, but from a small planet somewhere in the vicinity of Beetlejuice?" Arthur shrugged in a so-so sort of way. "I don't know," he said, taking a pull of beer. "Why, do you think it's the sort of thing you're likely to say?" Ford gave up. It really wasn't worth bothering at the moment, what with the world being about to end. He just said, "Drink up," and added, perfectly factually, "The world's about to end." Arthur gave the rest of the pub another wan smile. The rest of the pub frowned at him. A man waved at him to stop smiling at them and mind his own business. "This must be Thursday," said Arthur to himself, sinking low over his beer. "I never could get the hang of Thursdays." On this particular Thursday, something was moving quietly through the ionosphere many miles above the surface of the planet. Several somethings, in fact. Several dozen huge, yellow, chunky, slab-like somethings. Huge as office blocks, silent as birds. They soared with ease, basking in electromagnetic rays from the star Sol, biding their time, grouping, preparing. The planet beneath them was almost perfectly oblivious of their presence, which was just how they wanted it for the moment. The huge yellow somethings went unnoticed at Goonhilly. They passed over Cape Canaveral without a blip, and Wimmera and Jodrell Bank looked straight through them, which was a pity, because it was exactly the sort of thing they'd been looking for all these years. The only place they registered at all was on a small black device called a sub-ether sensomatic, which winked away quietly to itself. It nestled in the darkness inside a leather satchel which Ford Prefect habitually wore slung around his neck. The contents of Ford Prefect's satchel were quite interesting, and would have made any Earth physicist's eyes pop out of his head, which is why he always concealed them by keeping a couple of dog-eared scripts for plays he pretended he was auditioning for stuffed in the top. He also had a device which looked rather like a largish electronic calculator. This had about 100 tiny flat press buttons and a screen about 4 inches square on which any one of 1,000,000 pages could be summoned at a moment's notice. It looked insanely complicated, and this was one of the reasons why the snug plastic cover it fitted into had the words "Don't Panic" printed on it in large, friendly letters. The reason why it was published in the form of a micro-sub-meson electronic component is that if it were printed in normal book form, an interstellar hitchhiker would require several inconveniently large buildings to carry it around in. Beneath that in Ford Prefect's satchel were a few biros, a notepad, and a largish bath towel from Marks and Spencer. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy has a few things to say on the subject of towels. A towel, it says, is about the most massively useful thing an interstellar hitchhiker can have. Partly it has great practical value. You can wrap it around you for warmth as you bound across the cold moons of Jaglan Beta. You can lie on it on the brilliant marble-sanded beaches of Santraginus V. You can sleep under it beneath the stars which shine so redly on the desert world of Caprafoon. Use it to sail a mini-raft down the slow, heavy river Moth. Wet it for use in hand-to-hand combat. Wrap it round your head to ward off noxious fumes or avoid the gaze of the ravenous bug-bladder beast of Traal. A mind-bogglingly stupid animal, it assumes that if you can't see it, it can't see you. Daft as a brush, but very, very ravenous. You can wave your towel in emergencies as a distress signal, and of course dry yourself off with it if it still seems to be clean enough. Any man who can hitch the length and breadth of the galaxy, rough it, slum it, struggle against terrible odds, win through and still know where his towel is clearly a man to be reckoned with. Hence a phrase that has passed into hitchhiking slang, as in, "Hey, you sass that hoopy Ford Prefect? There's a frood who really knows where his towel is." "You got a towel with you?" said Ford suddenly to Arthur. Arthur, struggling through his third pint, looked round at him. "Why, what? No, should I have?" He'd given up being surprised. There didn't seem to be any point any longer. Ford clicked his tongue in irritation. "Drink up," he urged. At that moment the dull sound of a rumbling crash from outside filtered through the low murmur of the pub. Arthur choked on his beer, leapt to his feet. "What's that?" he yelped. "Don't worry," said Ford, "they haven't started yet." "Oh, thank God for that," said Arthur, and relaxed. "It's probably just your house being knocked down," said Ford, downing his last pint. "What?" shouted Arthur. Suddenly Ford's spell was broken. Arthur looked wildly around him and ran to the window. "It hardly makes any difference at this stage," said Ford. "Let them have their fun." "Fun?" yelped Arthur. He quickly checked out of the window again that they were talking about the same thing. "Damn their fun!" he shouted, and ran out of the pub, furiously waving a nearly empty beer glass. He made no friends at all in the pub that lunchtime. "Stop, you vandals, you home-wreckers!" bawled Arthur. "You half-crazed Visigoths, stop, will you?" Ford would have to go after him. Turning quickly to the barman, he asked for 4 packets of peanuts. "There you are, sir," said the barman, slapping the packets on the bar. 28 pence, if you'd be so kind." Ford was very kind. He gave the barman another £5 note and told him to keep the change. The barman looked at it and then looked at Ford. He suddenly shivered. He experienced a momentary sensation that he didn't understand, because no one on Earth had ever experienced it before. In moments of great stress, every life form that exists gives out a tiny subliminal signal. This signal simply communicates an exact and almost pathetic sense of how far that being is from the place of his birth. On Earth, it's never possible to be further than 16,000 miles from your birthplace, which really isn't very far, so such signals are too minute to be noticed. Ford Prefect was at this moment under great stress, and he was born 600 light-years away in the near vicinity of Betelgeuse. The barman reeled for a moment, hit by a shocking, incomprehensible sense of distance. He didn't know what it meant, but he looked at Ford Prefect with a new sense of respect, almost awe. "Are you serious, sir?" he said, in a small whisper which had the effect of silencing the pub. "You think the world's going to end?" "Yes," said Ford. "But this afternoon?" Ford had recovered himself. He was at his flippest. "Yes," he said gaily, "in less than 2 minutes, I would estimate." The barman couldn't believe this conversation he was having, but he couldn't believe the sensation he'd just had either. "Isn't there anything we can do about it, then?" he said. "No, nothing," said Ford, stuffing the peanuts into his pocket. "I thought we were meant to lie down, or put a paper bag over our head or something." "If you like, yes," said Ford. "Will that help?" asked the barman. "No," said Ford, and gave him a friendly smile. "Excuse me," he said, "I've got to go." With a wave, he left. The pub was silent a moment longer. The barman cleared his throat. He heard himself say, "Last orders, please." The huge yellow machines began to sink downwards and move faster. Ford knew they were there. This wasn't the way he'd wanted it. Running up the lane, Arthur had nearly reached his house. He didn't notice how cold it had suddenly become. He didn't notice the wind. He didn't notice the sudden irrational squall of rain. He didn't notice anything but the caterpillar bulldozers crawling over the rubble that had been his home. "You barbarians," he yelled. "I'll sue the council for every penny it's got. I'll have you hung, drawn and quartered, and whipped and boiled until you've had enough." Ford was running after him very fast. "And then I'll do it again," yelled Arthur. "And when I've finished I'll take all the little bits and I'll jump on them." Arthur didn't notice that the men were running from the bulldozers. He didn't notice that Mr. Prosser was staring hectically into the sky. What Mr. Prosser had noticed was that huge yellow somethings were screaming through the clouds. Impossibly huge yellow somethings. "And I'll carry on jumping on them," yelled Arthur, "until I get blisters, or I can think of anything even more unpleasant to do." Arthur tripped and fell headlong, rolled and landed flat on his back. At last he noticed that something was going on. His finger shot upwards. "What the hell's that?" he shrieked. Whatever it was raced across the sky in its monstrous yellowness, tore the sky apart with a mind-buggering noise, and leapt off into the distance, leaving the gaping air to shut behind it with a bang that drove your ears 6 feet into your skull. Another one followed, and did exactly the same thing, only louder. A sudden silence hit the earth. If anything, it was worse than the noise. For a while nothing happened. The great ships hung motionless in the sky over every nation on earth. Motionless they hung, huge, heavy and steady in the sky, a blasphemy against nature. Many people went straight into shock as their minds tried to encompass what they were looking at. The ships hung in the sky in much the same way that bricks don't. And still nothing happened. Then there was a slight whisper, a sudden spacious whisper of open ambient sound. Every hi-fi set in the world, every radio, every television, quietly turned itself on. Every tin can, every dustbin, every window, every car, every wine glass, every sheet of rusty metal became activated as an acoustically perfect sounding board. Before the earth passed away, it was going to be treated to the very ultimate in sound reproduction, the greatest public address system ever built. But there was no concert, no music, no fanfare, just a simple message. "People of Earth, your attention please," a voice said, and it was wonderful. Wonderful, perfect, quadraphonic sound, with distortion levels so low as to make a brave man weep. "This is Prostechnik Vogon Jeltz of the Galactic Hyperspace Planning Council," the voice continued. "As you will no doubt be aware, the plans for development of the outlying regions of the galaxy require the building of a hyperspatial express route through your star system, and regrettably your planet is one of those scheduled for demolition. The process will take slightly less than 2 of your Earth minutes. Thank you." The PA died away. Uncomprehending terror settled on the watching people of Earth. Panic sprouted again. desperate fleeing panic, but there was nowhere to flee to. Observing this, the Vogons turned on their PA again. It said, "There's no point in acting all surprised about it. All the planning charts and demolition orders have been on display on your local planning department in Alpha Centauri for 50 of your Earth years, so you've had plenty of time to lodge any formal complaint, and it's far too late to start making a fuss about it now." The PA fell silent again, and its echo drifted off across the land. By this time somebody somewhere must have manned a radio transmitter, located a wavelength, and broadcast a message back to the Vogon ships, to plead on behalf of the planet. Nobody ever heard what they said. They only heard the reply. "What do you mean you've never been to Alpha Centauri? For heaven's sake, mankind, it's only 4 light years away, you know. I'm sorry, but if you can't be bothered to take an interest in local affairs, that's your own lookout. Energize the demolition beams." Light poured out of the hatchways. "I don't know," said the voice on the PA. "Apathetic bloody planet, I've no sympathy at all." It cut off. There was a terrible, ghastly silence. There was a terrible, ghastly noise. There was a terrible, ghastly silence. The Vogon constructor fleet coasted away into the inky, starry void. Somewhere in a small, dark cabin, buried deep in the intestines of Prostetnik Vogon Jeltz's flagship, a small match flared nervously. The owner of the match was not a Vogon, but he knew all about them, and was right to be nervous. His name was Ford Prefect. He looked about the cabin, but could see very little. Strange monstrous shadows loomed and leapt with the tiny flickering flame, but all was quiet. He breathed a silent thank you to the Dentrassi. The Dentrassi are an unruly tribe of gourmands, a wild but pleasant bunch whom the Vogons had recently taken to employing as catering staff on their long-haul fleets, on the strict understanding that they kept themselves very much to themselves. This suited the Dentrassi fine, because they loved Vogon money, which is one of the hardest currencies in space, but loathed the Vogons themselves. The only sort of Vogon a Dentrassi liked to see was an annoyed Vogon. It was because of this tiny piece of information that Ford Prefect was not now a whiff of hydrogen, ozone, and carbon monoxide. He heard a slight groan, and saw a heavy shape moving slightly on the floor. Quickly he shook the match out, reached into his pocket, found what he was looking for, and took it out. He ripped it open and shook it. He crouched on the floor. The shape moved again. Ford said, "I bought some peanuts." Arthur Dent moved and groaned again, muttering incoherently. "Here, have some," urged Ford, shaking the packet again. "If you've never been through a matter transference beam before, you've probably lost some salt and protein. The beer you had should have cushioned your system a bit." "What?" said Arthur Dent, opening his eyes. "It's dark," he said. "Yes," said Ford Prefect, "it's dark." "No light," said Arthur Dent. "Dark, no light." One of the things Ford Prefect had always found hardest to understand about humans was their habit of continually stating and repeating the very, very obvious, as in, "It's a nice day," or "You're very tall," or "Oh dear, you seem to have fallen down a 30-foot well, are you all right?" At first Ford had formed a theory to account for this strange behaviour. If human beings don't keep exercising their lips, he thought, their mouths probably seize up. After a few months' consideration and observation, he abandoned this theory in favour of a new one. If they don't keep exercising their lips, he thought, their brains start working. After a while he abandoned this one as well, as being obstructively cynical, and decided he quite liked human beings after all, but he always remained desperately worried about the terrible number of things that they didn't know about. "Yes," he agreed with Arthur, "no light." He helped Arthur to some peanuts. "How do you feel?" he asked him. "Like a military academy," said Arthur. "Bits of me keep on passing out." Ford stared at him blankly in the darkness. "If I asked you where the hell we were," said Arthur, "would I regret it?" Ford stood up. "We're safe," he said. "Oh good," said Arthur. "We're in a small galley cabin," said Ford, "in one of the spaceships of the Vogon constructor fleet." "Ah," said Arthur. "This is obviously some strange usage of the word safe that I wasn't previously aware of." Ford struck another match to help him search for the light switch. Arthur struggled to his feet and hugged himself apprehensively. "How did we get here?" he asked, shivering slightly. "We hitched a lift," said Ford. "Excuse me," said Arthur. "Are you trying to tell me that we just stuck our thumbs out and some green bug-eyed monster stuck his head out and said, 'Hi fellas, hop right in, I can take you as far as the Basingstoke roundabout'?" "Well," said Ford, "the thumb's an electronic sub-ether signalling device. The roundabout's at Barnard's Star, 6 light-years away, but otherwise that's more or less right." "And the bug-eyed monster?" "Is green, yes." "Fine," said Arthur. "When can I go home?" "You can't," said Ford Prefect, and found the light switch. "Shade your eyes," he said, and turned it on. Even Ford was surprised. "Good grief," said Arthur. "Is this really the interior of a flying saucer? It's a bit squalid, isn't it?" Ford frowned at the grubby mattresses, unwashed cups, and unidentifiable bits of smelly alien underwear that lay around the cramped cabin. "Well, this is a working ship, you see," said Ford. "These are the Dentrassi sleeping quarters." "I thought you said they were called Vogons or something." "Yes," said Ford. "The Vogons run the ship. The Dentrassi are the cooks. They let us on board. Here, have a look at this," said Ford. Ford handed the book to Arthur. "What is it?" said Arthur. "The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's a sort of electronic book. It tells you everything you need to know about anything." Arthur turned it over nervously in his hands. "I like the cover," he said. "Don't panic. It's the first helpful or intelligible thing anybody's said to me all day." "I'll show you how it works," said Ford. "You press this button here, you see, and the screen lights up, giving you the index. You want to know about Vogons, so enter that name." His fingers tapped some keys, and there we are. The words "Vogon Constructor Fleets" flared in green across the screen. Ford pressed a large red button at the bottom of the screen, and words began to undulate across it. At the same time, the book began to speak the entry as well, in a still, quiet, measured voice. This is what the book said. "Vogon Constructor Fleets. Here is what to do if you want to get a lift from a Vogon. Forget it. They are one of the most unpleasant races in the galaxy. Not actually evil, but bad-tempered, bureaucratic, officious, and callous. They wouldn't even lift a finger to save their own grandmothers from the ravenous bug-blatter beast of Tral without orders, signed in triplicate, sent in, sent back, queried, lost, found, subjected to public inquiry, lost again, and finally buried in soft peat for 3 months and recycled as firelighters. The best way to get a drink out of a Vogon is to stick your finger down his throat, and the best way to irritate him is to feed his grandmother to the ravenous bug-blatter beast of Tral. On no account allow a Vogon to read poetry at you." Arthur blinked at it. "What a strange book. How do we get a lift, then?" "That's the point, it's out of date now," said Ford, sliding the book back into its cover. "I'm doing the field research for the new revised edition." Arthur looked lost. "Unfortunately, I got stuck on the Earth for rather longer than I intended," said Ford. "I came for a week, got stuck for 15 years. "Ford," insisted Arthur, "I don't know if this sounds like a silly question, but what am I doing here?" "I rescued you from the Earth." "And what's happened to the Earth?" "Ah, it's been demolished." "Has it?" said Arthur levelly. "Yes, it just boiled away into space." "Look," said Arthur, "I'm a bit upset about that." Ford frowned to himself, and seemed to roll the thought about his mind. "Yes, I can understand that," he said at last. "Understand that?" shouted Arthur. Ford sprang up. "Keep looking at the book," he hissed urgently. "What? Don't panic." "I'm not panicking." "Yes, you are." "All right, so I'm panicking. What else is there to do?" "You just come along with me and have a good time. The galaxy's a fun place. You'll need to have this fish in your ear." "I beg your pardon," said Arthur, rather politely, he thought. Ford was holding up a small glass jar, which quite clearly had a small yellow fish wriggling around in it. Arthur blinked at him. He wished there was something simple and recognisable he could grasp hold of. He would have felt quite safe if, alongside the Dentrassi underwear and the man from Beetlejuice holding up a small yellow fish and offering to put it in his ear, he had been able to see just a small packet of cornflakes. But he couldn't, and he didn't feel safe. Suddenly a violent noise leapt at them from no source that he could identify. He gasped in terror at what sounded like a man trying to gargle whilst fighting off a pack of wolves. "Shush!" said Ford. "Listen, it might be important." "Important? It's the Vogon captain making an announcement." "You mean that's how the Vogons talk?" "Listen." "But I can't speak Vogon." "You don't need to. Just put this fish in your ear." Ford, with a lightning movement, clapped his hand to Arthur's ear, and he had the sudden sickening sensation of the fish slithering deep into his aural tract. Gasping with horror, he scrabbled at his ear for a second or so, but then slowly turned goggle-eyed with wonder. He was still listening to the howling gargles, he knew that, only now it had somehow taken on the semblance of perfectly straightforward English. This is what he heard. "This is your captain speaking, so stop whatever you're doing and pay attention. First of all, I see from our instruments that we have a couple of hitchhikers on board. Hello, wherever you are. I just want to make it totally clear that you are not at all welcome. I worked hard to get where I am today, and I didn't become captain of a Vogon constructor ship simply so I could turn it into a taxi service for a load of degenerate freeloaders. I've sent out a search party, and as soon as they find you, I will put you off the ship. If you're lucky, I might read you some of my poetry first. Secondly, we're about to jump into hyperspace for the journey to Barnard's star. On arrival, we will stay in dock for a 72-hour refit, and no one's to leave the ship during that time. I repeat, all planet leave is cancelled. I've just had an unhappy love affair, so I don't see why anybody else should have a good time. Message ends." The noise stopped. Arthur discovered to his embarrassment that he was lying curled up in a small ball on the floor with his arms wrapped round his head. He smiled weakly. "No, don't move," said Ford. "You'd better be prepared for the jump into hyperspace. It's unpleasantly like being drunk." "What's so unpleasant about being drunk?" "Ask a glass of water." Arthur thought about this. "Ford," he said, "what's this fish doing in my ear?" "It's translating for you. It's a Babel fish. Look it up in the book if you like." He tossed over the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and then curled himself up into a fetal ball to prepare himself for the jump. At that moment the bottom fell out of Arthur's mind. His eyes turned inside out, his feet began to leak out of the top of his head, the room folded flat around him, spun around, shifted out of existence, and left him sliding into his own navel. They were passing through hyperspace. "The Babel fish," said the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy quietly, "is small, yellow, and leech-like, and probably the oddest thing in the universe. It feeds on brainwave energy received not from its own carrier but from those around it. It absorbs all unconscious mental frequencies from this brainwave energy to nourish itself with. It then excretes into the mind of its carrier a telepathic matrix formed by combining the conscious thought frequencies with nerve signals picked up from the speech centres of the brain which has supplied them. The practical upshot of all this is that if you stick a Babel fish in your ear, you can instantly understand anything said to you in any form of language. Now it is such a bizarrely improbable coincidence that anything so mind-bogglingly useful could have evolved purely by chance, that some thinkers have chosen to see it as a final and clinching proof of the non-existence of God. The argument goes something like this. "I refuse to prove that I exist," says God, "for proof denies faith, and without faith I am nothing." "But," says man, "the Babel fish is a dead giveaway, isn't it? It proves you exist, and so therefore, by your own argument, you don't. QED. "Oh dear," says God, "I hadn't thought of that," and promptly vanishes in a puff of logic. "Oh, that was easy," says man, and for an encore goes on to prove that black is white, and gets himself killed on the next zebra crossing. Most leading theologians claim that this argument is a load of dingo's kidneys, but that didn't stop Oolong Kalufid making a small fortune when he used it as the central theme of his best-selling book, Well, That About Wraps It Up for God. Meanwhile, the poor Babelfish, by effectively removing all barriers to communication between different races and cultures, has caused more and bloodier wars than anything else in the history of creation. Arthur let out a low groan. He was horrified to discover that the kick through hyperspace hadn't killed him. He was now 6 light years away from the place that the Earth would have been if it still existed. Ford, if you're a researcher on this book thing, and you were on Earth, you must have been gathering material on it. Well, I was able to extend the original entry a bit, yeah. Let me see what it says in this edition, then. Okay. He passed it over again. Arthur grabbed hold of it and tried to stop his hand shaking. He pressed the entry for the relevant page. The screen flashed and swirled and resolved into a page of print. Arthur stared at it. It doesn't have an entry. Ford looked over his shoulder. Yes, it does, he said. Down there at the bottom of the screen, just under Eccentrica Galumbits, the triple-breasted whore of Eroticon 6. Arthur followed Ford's finger and saw where it was pointing. For a moment it still didn't register, then his mind nearly blew up. Harmless? One word? Ford shrugged. Well, there are 100 billion stars in the galaxy, and only a limited amount of space in the book. No one knew much about the Earth, of course. Well, I hope you managed to rectify that a bit. Yeah, well, I managed to transmit a new entry off to the editor. He had to trim it a bit, but it's still an improvement. And what's it say now? Said Arthur. Mostly harmless, admitted Ford with a slightly embarrassed cough. Mostly harmless, shouted Arthur. What was that noise? Hissed Ford. It was me shouting, shouted Arthur. No, shut up, said Ford. I think we're in trouble. Outside the door were the clear sounds of marching footsteps. There was a sharp, ringing rap on the door. Who is it? Said Arthur. Well, said Ford, if we're lucky, it's just the Vogons come to throw us into space. And if we're unlucky, the captain might be serious in his threat that he's going to read us some of his poetry first. Vogon poetry is, of course, the 3rd worst in the universe. The 2nd worst is that of the Asgoths of Korea. During a recitation by their poet-master Grunthos the Flatulent of his poem Ode to a Small Lump of Green Putty I Found in My Armpit One Midsummer Morning, 4 of his audience died of internal hemorrhaging, and the president of the Mid-Galactic Arts Nobbling Council survived only by gnawing one of his own legs off. Grunthos is reported to have been disappointed by the poem's reception, and was about to embark on a reading of his 12-book epic entitled My Favourite Bath-Time Gurgles, when his own major intestine, in a desperate attempt to save life and civilization, leapt straight up through his neck and throttled his brain. The very worst poetry of all perished along with its creator, Paula Nancy Millstone Jennings of Greenbridge, Essex, England, in the destruction of the planet Earth. Prostetnik Vogon Jeltz smiled very slowly. This was done not so much for effect as because he was trying to remember the sequence of muscle movements. He'd had a terribly therapeutic yell at his prisoners, and was now feeling quite relaxed and ready for a little callousness. The prisoners sat in poetry appreciation chairs, strapped in. Vogons suffered no illusions as to the regard their works were generally held in. The sweat stood out on Ford Prefect's brow and slid around the electrodes strapped to his temples. These were attached to a battery of electronic equipment, imagery intensifiers, rhythmic modulators, alliterative residulators, and simile dumpers, all designed to heighten the experience of the poem and make sure that not a single nuance of the poet's thought was lost. Arthur Dent sat and quivered. He had no idea what he was in for, but he knew that he hadn't liked anything that had happened so far, and didn't think things were likely to change. The Vogon began to read, a fetid passage of his own devising. "Oh, Freddled Grunt Bugley," he began. Spasms racked Ford's body. This was worse than even he'd been prepared for. "Thy micturations are to me as plurdled gobbleblodgets on a lurgid bee. Group, I implore thee, my footling turling-dromes." His voice was rising to a horrible pitch of impassioned stridency, and hooptuously strangle me with crinkly brindle wardles, or I will rend thee into gobberworts with my blurgle crunch and see if I don't." Ford Prefect cried out and threw one final spasm as the electronic enhancement of the last line caught him full blast across the temples. He went limp. Arthur lolled. "Now, earthlings," whirred the Vogon. He didn't know that Ford Prefect was in fact from a small planet somewhere in the vicinity of Betelgeuse, and wouldn't have cared if he had. "I present you with a simple choice. Either die in the vacuum of space, or—" he paused for melodramatic effect. "Tell me how good you thought my poem was." He threw himself backwards into a huge leathery bat-shaped seat and watched them. He did the smile again. Ford was rasping for breath. He rolled his dusty tongue around his parched mouth and moaned. Arthur said brightly, "Actually, I quite liked it." Ford turned and gaped. Here was an approach that had quite simply not occurred to him. The Vogon raised a surprised eyebrow that effectively obscured his nose, and was therefore no bad thing. "Oh, good," he whirred in considerable astonishment. "Oh, yes," said Arthur. "I thought that some of the metaphysical imagery was really particularly effective." Ford continued to stare at him, slowly organising his thoughts around this totally new concept. Were they really going to be able to bareface their way out of this? "Yes, do continue," invited the Vogon. "Oh, and, interesting rhythmic devices too," continued Arthur, "which seemed to counterpoint the, he floundered. Ford leapt to his rescue, hazarding, "Counterpoint the surrealism of the underlying metaphor of the, he floundered too, but Arthur was ready again. "Humanity of the vogonity," Ford hissed at him. "Oh yes, vogonity, sorry, of the poet's compassionate soul." Arthur felt he was on a home stretch now. "Which contrives through the medium of the verse structure to sublimate this, transcend that, and come to terms with the fundamental dichotomies of the other." He was reaching a triumphant crescendo, "and one is left with the profound and vivid insight into the—" Ford leapt in with the coup de grace. "Into whatever it was the poem was about," he yelled. Out of the corner of his mouth, "Well done, Arthur, that was very good." The Vogon perused them. For a moment his embittered racial soul had been touched, but he thought no, too little too late. His voice took on the quality of a cat snagging brushed nylon. "So what you are saying is that I write poetry because underneath my mean, callous, heartless exterior I really just want to be loved? Is that it?" Ford laughed a nervous laugh. "Well, I mean, yes," he said. "Don't we all? Deep down." The Vogon stood up. "No, you're completely wrong," he said. "I just write poetry to throw my mean, callous, heartless exterior into sharp relief. I'm going to throw you off the ship anyway. Guard, take the prisoners to number 3 airlock and throw them out." "What?" shouted Ford. A huge young Vogon guard stepped forward and yanked them out of their straps with his huge blubbery arms. "Resistance is useless," shouted the Vogon guard. It was the first phrase he'd learnt when he joined the Vogon Guard Corps. The captain watched with detached amusement, and then turned away. Arthur stared round him wildly. "I don't want to die now," he yelled. "I've still got a headache. I don't want to go to heaven with a headache. I'd be all cross and wouldn't enjoy it." The guard grasped them both firmly round the neck, and bowing deferentially towards his captain's back, hoiked them both protesting out of the bridge. The steel door closed, and the captain was on his own again. He hummed quietly and mused to himself, lightly fingering his notebook of verses. "Counterpoint the surrealism of the underlying metaphor. Death's too good for them," he said. The long steel-lined corridor echoed to the feeble struggles of the two humanoids clamped firmly under rubbery Vogon armpits. "Resistance is useless," bellowed the guard. "Oh, give it a rest," said Ford. He twisted his head until he was looking straight up into the captor's face. A thought struck him. "Do you really enjoy this sort of thing?" he asked suddenly. The Vogon stopped dead, and a look of immense stupidity seeped slowly across his face. "Enjoy?" he boomed. "What do you mean?" Does it give you a full, satisfying life? Stomping around, shouting, pushing people off spaceships?" The Vogon stared up at the low steel ceiling, and his eyebrows almost rolled over each other. His mouth slacked. Finally he said, "Well, the hours are good." "They'd have to be," agreed Ford. Arthur twisted his head round to look at Ford. "Ford, what are you doing?" he asked in an amazed whisper. "Oh, just trying to take an interest in the world around me. So, the hours are pretty good then," he resumed. The Vogon stared down at him as sluggish thoughts moiled around in the murky depths. "Yeah," he said, "but now you come to mention it, most of the actual minutes are pretty lousy. Except some of the shouting I quite like." "Yeah, you're good at that, I can tell. But if it's mostly lousy," said Ford, "then why do you do it?" I dunno, really. I just sort of do it. My aunt said that spaceship guard was a good career for a young Vogon. You know, the uniform, the low-slung stun-ray holster, the mindless tedium. "There you are, Arthur," said Ford, with an air of someone reaching the conclusion of his argument. "You think you've got problems. Try and understand his problem. Here he is, poor lad, his entire life's work, stamping around, throwing people off spaceships." "And shouting," added the guard. "And shouting, sure," said Ford. "And he doesn't even know why he's doing it." Arthur agreed that this was very sad. He did this with a small, feeble gesture, because he was too asphyxiated to speak. Deep rumblings of bemusement came from the guard. "Well, now you put it like that, I suppose." "Good lad," encouraged Ford. "All right. So, what's the alternative?" "Well," said Ford, brightly but slowly, "stop doing it, of course. Tell them you're not going to do it any more." That doesn't sound that great to me." Ford suddenly felt the moment slipping away. "How? That's just the start, you see. There's more to it than that." But at that moment the guard renewed his grip and continued his original purpose of lugging his prisoners to the airlock. He was obviously quite touched. "No, I think if it's all the same to you," he said, "I'd better get you both shoved into this airlock and then go and get on with some other bits of shouting I've got to do." It wasn't all the same to Ford Prefect at all. "But look," he said, less slowly, less brightly, "there's music and art and things to tell you about yet." "Resistance is useless," bellowed the guard, and then added, "You see, if I keep it up I can eventually get promoted to senior shouting officer, and there aren't usually many vacancies for non-shouting and non-pushing people about officers, so I think I'd better stick to what I know." They'd now reached the airlock, a large circular steel hatchway of massive strength and weight, let into the inner skin of the craft. The guard operated a control, and the hatchway swung smoothly open. "But thanks for taking an interest," said the Vogon guard. "Bye now." He flung Ford and Arthur through the hatchway into the small chamber within. "But listen," he shouted to the guard, "there's a whole world you don't know about. How about this?" Desperately he grabbed for the only bit of culture he knew offhand. He hummed the first bar of Beethoven's Fifth. "Da-da-da-dam. Doesn't that stir anything in you?" "No," said the guard, "not really, but I'll mention it to my aunt." If he said anything further after that, it was lost. The hatchway sealed itself tight, and all sound was lost by the faint, distant hum of the ship's engines. Ford looked round, panting. "Potentially bright lad, I thought," he said, and slumped against the curved wall. "You know," said Arthur, "it's at times like this, when I'm trapped in a Vogon airlock with a man from Beetlejuice, about to die of asphyxiation in deep space, that I really wish I'd listened to what my mother told me when I was young." "Why, what did she tell you?" "I don't know, I didn't listen." A motor whirred. A slight hiss built into a deafening roar of rushing air as the outer hatchway opened onto an empty blackness studded with tiny, impossible bright points of light. Ford and Arthur popped out into space like corks from a toy gun.